My name is Fugan, and I'm joining you from Village Zendo on Cape Cod. And this way of getting together on Zoom is really amazing. Seeing people near and far, all of us sitting together. There's no commute from the Cape now, which is wonderful. And I'm grateful to the unending work that I know is going on to make this so smooth, this practice so powerful for all of us. And we're starting out here, and I'm sure at the Village Zendo, to dream about in-person practice. And some of the things that didn't translate so well to this online medium have been on my mind, have been calling out. The other night, Roshi mentioned bowing. And I also miss that embodied practice of letting go of ourselves as we put our bodies on the ground. We put our head right on the floor and raise our hands up, and our butts are in the air. And as Roshi has said, this is a time where we can kind of let go of a little bit of the ego in our head. And I also miss the Han quite a bit. This Han that calls us to practice. And some of you I think have joined us since we started online zazen, which is amazing. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Han is a wooden sounding board that's struck with a wooden mallet. And it signals us to come to the Zendo for practice, for talks and other activities as well. The Han signal itself is this relatively long and complex pattern of strikes on the Han, and they're organized into 3 consecutively shorter and faster rounds. And when you play the full pattern, it lasts almost 10 minutes. But by the end of the second round, which is really towards the end of those 10 minutes, we should all be seated in the Zendo. And we sit together and we listen to that final round, which ends in a flurry of strikes and then these final 3 hits. Bak, bak, pak. And this is a sounded transition that unfurls in time, and it guides us to our cushions, back to our practice of zazen. And it really guides us into this moment, this living moment, through sound and through listening. And we can say that the Han is directly preaching the Dharma when we can listen. You know, what is the sound of the Han is really the same as Hakuin's question about the sound of one hand clapping. So our study of Uji this winter has been really rich. And I guess really since the fall this started, as we prepared for Ango, we've been listening to talks on Uji. We've been reading and discussing Uji. Some of us were there on New Year's Eve, and we got to experience Ankyo Roshi's brilliant visual and sound meditation on the time being. And we've sat with this fascicle, this piece of Dogen's writing, and we've lived with it. And this has been a privilege, especially this year during the pandemic. This year that's overflowing with so much struggling, grief, and so many challenges for all of us. This is my second Ango that I've had the opportunity to study Uji. And since the last one, which was a number of years ago, I've come back to this text often. And it is still confounding and challenging. Maybe more so now than it was at the beginning. And so with that in mind, this morning, my talk is more about how to approach Uji than trying to figure out what it is. This talk is about listening to the time being. Listen, listen. This wonderful sound brings me back to my true self. This gata is familiar to many of us. It was offered by Thich Nhat Hanh as a way to listen to the sound of a bell. Also to listen to the sound of the phone ringing or the sound of car horns. Because, of course, all these sounds are only happening now. When we put the head down and let go, we listen. And we hear in this moment, just like the bak of the Han. In the Amitabha Sutra, the Buddha says that water, birds, and tree groves, all without exception, recite the Buddha's name, recite the Dharma. So the Han, jackhammers, sirens, the geese outside here on the marsh, they all recite the Buddha's names, recite the Dharma. And so how do we listen is an important question. An old Zen verse on this listening says, if you try to grasp it, you'll miss it. It has no form. If you try to let it go, you cannot separate from it. It is not formless. And this is also where the time being resides. Like the bell, we can listen to Uji, not only through our ears and minds, but with our whole being. And we listen to it only now, the only time we can hear it. Whether it's spoken aloud, or if we're reading it and hearing the sounds of the words in our mind, or even when we're paying attention to a talk about it. We meet Uji in this moment, this manifestation of the time being. So in Mahayana Buddhism, hearing is elevated as the most effective sense vehicle for liberation. And the common translation of Avalokiteshvara's name as the one who hears the cries of the world emphasizes this. And taking the vow to save all beings by waking ourselves up, we cannot help but hear the suffering of the world. And in listening, we take action to alleviate it. And this isn't hearing through the narrow path of intellectual conceptualization. Korean Zen master Seung San put it nicely. He said, when red appears, there's only red. When blue appears, only blue. When a hungry person appears, give them something to eat. Pauline Oliveros, who some of you are familiar with, was a composer, musician, a meditator, and also a prominent voice on ways of listening. She pioneered an approach to composition that she calls deep listening. And according to Oliveros, deep listening represents a heightened state of awareness and connects to all that there is. What is heard is changed by listening and changes the listener. And she calls this action of change that connects us so deeply through our experience of listening, quantum listening. Listening to this talk makes this moment a Dharma talk. Or as Ryotan Roshi said the other day, when we listen to him talk, he becomes the teacher. When he talks and we listen, we become the students. So this single bak on the Han unfolds over time, unfolds as a time being. When we listen to it in this way, we become the pattern. This being is revealed. Together, you and me are changing and being changed by time, revealed. So what is it? Be in your seat by the end of the second round. In his talk last week, Fugan Hoshi pointed to Dogen's stature as a poet. A wordsmith, I think, is the word he used. And I love this image of Dogen as a shaper of sounds and words. His writing style has been described as acoustic language, something meant to be heard orally, language that allows us to listen directly and intimately without getting stuck in parsing his meanings. So how we listen, how we handle those tools is really important. And lately my strategy has been to listen to Dogen like listening to the bell or the Han, like a poem, like music. For the time being, standing on top of the highest peak. For the time being, proceed along the bottom of the deepest ocean. For the time being, 3 heads and 8 arms. For the time being, an 8 or 16-foot body. For the time being, a staff or whisk. For the time being, a pillar or lantern. So there's a difference in the quality of mind we use when listening to everyday speech and musical speech, even when they're made of the same components. Musical speech or acoustic language reveals meaning in different pathways. Words become what Dogen calls mitsugo, or secret words. And the mitsu here means intimacy, lacking distance, so close that it's you. Among musicologists, ethnomusicologists, archaeologists, and folks who look at this stuff, there's really no agreement on how music arose in relation to human speech. But there's been agreement on the realms that musical speech applies to and how that relates to everyday language. All cultures associate something that we might call music with religion, and most have the tendency to render important ritual with musical characteristics. Music, the thinking goes, may have developed as a particular form of speech to communicate meanings beyond the everyday. As the ethnomusicologist David McAllister put it, music transforms everyday experience. And so how can musical listening transform our experience of Uji? One particular passage has been resonating with me all winter and really all year. And so in section 17, Dogen writes, "The time being is like this. Arriving is overwhelmed by arriving, but not by not arriving. Not arriving is overwhelmed by not arriving, but not by arriving. Mind overwhelms mind and sees mind. Word overwhelms word and sees words." And this is my favorite part. Overwhelming overwhelms overwhelming and sees overwhelming. Overwhelming is nothing but overwhelming. This is time. And we talked about this section yesterday at our Village Zendo Sangha sitting. And I think we were in agreement that the loss and pain, the grief and fear and uncertainty of this year, and kind of the general problems of things going wrong, leaves us all feeling overwhelmed. As one of my Sangha mates so beautifully put it, just the word overwhelming brings up the feeling of being trapped and tumbled in a giant wave. And that Dogen is using this idea, this term, as a tool for liberation, points to his genius. He plays with overwhelming and its sounding to free us from the conceptual cage that overwhelming puts us in. When he says arriving is overwhelmed by arriving, he's using the term overwhelming to obliterate ideas of arriving. When arriving is totally overwhelmed by arriving, it's fully itself in this moment. Not more than arriving, not about to arrive, not late, not the idea of arriving or less than, just arriving. Overwhelming here means completely taken over and fully penetrated. Nothing is left beyond arriving. The fullness of arriving can only be revealed when it is completely overwhelmed by nothing but itself, arriving. And at that moment, arriving sees itself, its true nature is revealed. And this is the same process with the sound of the bell, the bach on the han, for the cushion I'm sitting on and for this room, and for our pain and fear. Me talking, you listening. And so being overwhelmed is also liberated by being completely and to its exact limits in this moment overwhelmed. Overwhelming overwhelms overwhelming, and overwhelming sees itself. And this is time or liberation. Dragged down by the circumstances of our life, overwhelming arises in me. It's an idea that can hit like a tsunami. Letting the sense of this become completely overwhelmed, dropping into this moment of the time being. For the time being, proceed along the bottom of the deepest ocean. And great freedom arises, and action is possible. A crying person appears, and if it's you or me, we take care of them. Like arriving and not arriving, the cushion, the whisk, and the pillar, overwhelming is only available in our own moments, in our own overwhelming. So Dogen goes on and says, as overwhelming is caused by you, there's no overwhelming that is separate from you. The particular nature of each Dharma moment, state of being, is revealed as your time, when completely, fully, and to its exact limits, it's overwhelmed by itself in you, in your attention, in your deep listening. So this full kind of engagement can be understood as the freedom of each Dharma point, each of the 10,000 things stepping forward and being revealed, each seen fully as itself, 3 heads and 8 arms, this demon overwhelms 3 heads and 8 arms. The 8 or 16-foot body, this golden Buddha, overwhelms this golden Buddha, no more or no less, nothing to run away from or cling to. Each abides fully in the time being. Dogen says, things do not hinder one another, just as moments do not hinder one another. Each abides fully. So I was talking to a very prominent South Indian drummer some years ago, and we got into a long discussion about grooves and time flow in this music. And in this musical system, there are various patterns that drummers play and improvise to create the flow of time, of musical time. And these patterns usually extend over, a few beats or 3 or 4, Din tajonu titana jonu tajonu titana tajonu titana jonu tajonu titarigita din. Some, like this. But this drummer talked about something he called one-note sarvalagu, or one-note time flow. And he said this is expressed only by the truest musical master, maybe him. And in this vision, one note is played so perfectly that it becomes the flow of time. And at the moment, I thought he was just waxing poetic for me. But what is listening deeply to one sound, one moment? The sound and the hearer are transformed in that instant of playing or hearing or being, this quantum listening. And they're fully overwhelmed and revealed as the groove, as the flow of time, as the time being. And I've started to think of this as one-note samadhi. One-note samba, maybe. The moment fully revealed as flow. And so each bach in that Han pattern is fully itself and is also the pattern, the whole shape. And listening to each moment, the meaning of the whole is revealed. This is, again, Oliveira's quantum listening. The one note isn't stuck. It's not limited, it flows. And this flowing is fully realized in each singular instant. This is being. And it's fully interconnected of all these singularities. This is also time. And in listening, both being and time manifest as us, of course. And in this moment of pressure and fear and loneliness, can we let it fully manifest as it is? It's really scary to think about it. But to stop thinking and step in and tumble in the wave, tumble as the wave. In listening to this moment, this fullness, the self realizes the self. And it's scary and amazing. And this is the courage of what we're doing this morning, coming and sitting down. Dogen goes on to say, thus you go out and meet someone. Someone meets someone. You meet yourself. Going out meets going out. If these are not the actualization of time, they cannot be thus. Another of our Sangha members yesterday said it really well. She said, this is meeting someone, meeting yourself. This is just being human. It's entering the market, taking care of what's in front of us, putting on our mask, being the fullness of this time being. Roshi Shinshu Roberts says that in Dogen's writing, words go beyond pointing to liberation and become an agent of liberation. And I miss listening to the Han with all of you. And there's typically a poem inscribed on the Han instrument that expresses the imperative of each sounding. Take heed, time waits for no one. Of course, how could it? Because it's you. Wake up, don't waste a moment. With each strike of the Han, that sentiment is sent out into the world. But really it means show up now, right now, really, right this minute. Pauline Oliveros, on the score of a piece called Primordial Lift, put it this way: listening all over to oneself and others everywhere in the whole of the universe, all of the time. Listening all over to oneself and others everywhere in the whole of the universe, all of the time. Or maybe just fuck, fuck, fuck.